Good morning. I want to talk this morning about stage 5 of the 8-stage learning design framework, which is assessment. So assessment design is critical in any program. It's how most students will approach your course or program. Students generally work to the assessment despite whatever grand designs you have. So we have to be realistic about that. But I think it's really important that the assessment is well articulated throughout a program. So you already know who your students are going to be in stage 1 of the framework. So you can anticipate, for example, whether students have particular expectations of assessment and whether they'll need more support to adopt an alternative strategy than perhaps they're familiar with. In stage 2, you've already explored the context, so you also know what the discipline requirements are, what the expectations are, what the professional expectations are for assessment in your particular program. You've looked at media in stage 3, and therefore you also know what the intellectual structural capacity is, or the infrastructure, I should say, rather than intellectual. Sorry, it's very early in the morning. The infrastructure requirements for particular forms of assessment. There's no point in doing online computer assessment if people don't have computer access, and fairly obvious situations like that. And then you also, most importantly now, you're well into the notion of constructive alignment, that you set outcomes, you then assess them, and you teach to those outcomes. So assessment now is really dependent on the outcomes. What is it that you want students to be able to do? Because that is what you're assessing. So I already said in a previous video that dealt with stage 4, the intended learning outcomes, that the intended learning outcomes define what students will be able to do as a result of the learning rather than focus on the content itself. So you're not testing in assessment, you're not testing or measuring students' absorption of pure content. You are essentially trying to get students to demonstrate, to be able to evidence that they can achieve the outcomes that you've set. And that means really about assessing their skills, their attributes, using particular content. So think of content as, if you like, the vehicle through which you are allowing students to demonstrate their skills. And articulating assessment, therefore, is almost done at the same time as writing the outcomes. Certainly, as you're writing outcomes, you will be thinking, okay, that's a brilliant outcome, but there's no way I can ever assess that. But I think it's really important to be ambitious when you write your outcomes, and then try and be equally ambitious in how you might produce realistic assessment. There are a number of facets in terms of assessment design that you do have to bear in mind. Clearly, it has to be reliable, it has to be valid, and it's worth looking up those terms if you're not familiar with them. You also have to think very seriously about the real-world opportunities for that assessment. So having something that's completely abstract sometimes is necessary if you're teaching some aspect of ancient Greek ethics. It's unlikely that you can provide a real-world scenario. Although I can think of a few examples, it's not that easy to provide that. But if you're teaching contemporary marketing, it really is a rich environment for you to deploy assessment based in real-world contexts. And students will always respond better to real-world assessment examples. So it's worth thinking about assessment in terms of being essentially as an opportunity for students to demonstrate that they can evidence achievement of outcomes. If you think about assessment in those terms rather than in terms of assessing the content that you've delivered in the classroom, you're starting in a great place. Think about it as being relatively flexible. You should be able to tweak your assessment as you revise your outcomes. So they really are done together.